Thanks. So now I'm going to present a little bit of work that was done by Hannah Schubert, who's a postdoctorate researcher in our group, and really talking about data, a data-driven approach to figure out how much adult cattle weigh. We had some discussions about this in Hall B earlier in the day about antimicrobial resistance and the metrics that we use and how much do cattle really weigh. So we decided to put some data behind this. We had done some work in our group about these different metrics, ways of measuring antimicrobial use. And in doing this, really looked at, okay, well, do we know if we want to propose individual metrics for our country, the United Kingdom, do we know how much dairy cattle in the United Kingdom weigh? And in doing a literature search to write this paper, the team was really a bit unhappy about the fact that they couldn't find a lot of evidence in the literature of where the values that are used in papers came from. And these range from 425 kilos for a dairy cow to 680 kilos. But they look like they all reference another reference that when you go to that reference doesn't seem to have, just seems like they made up the number, took a best guess of a number. And the researchers in our group were not happy with this. So they said, we've got to do something, we've got to find some information. Because we would also expect an average weight to vary by breed, to vary by different populations in different countries. And there was something presented earlier in Hall B about the weight of dairy cattle, of feedlot cattle in the US and dairy cattle in New Zealand. And we would expect those to be different because they're different breeds of cattle and they're managed in different ways. But we rarely find this accounted for in the literature. And why does it matter? Well, as veterinarians, it matters to us because we're dosing medicines for cattle, and we usually use that dose on a weight of cattle, so we estimate their weights to calibrate our dosages. And you can imagine that if you're dosing a cow that you think is about 525 kilos, you're going to give her a different dosage than if you're dosing a cow that weighs 775 kilos. And I'll have to admit that I'm the awkward parent at the doctor's office when I go in and I take my child that needs an antibiotic dosage, and they say, well, the dosage for penicillin for a 2 to 6 year old is this. And I say, but my child weighs 22 kilos. So I want the dosage based on their weight, not their age, because my 2-year-old and my 6-year-old weigh very different amounts. So I always end up either bringing back antimicrobial to the pharmacist because I didn't use it all, or going back to get some more because I dose them based on weight, not just what the book says a 2 to 6-year-old should use. So as veterinarians, I think we do that a lot better than human medics do. And we know that, so these incorrect weights, you're either overdosing or you're underdosing these animals, and that can either lead to overuse of antibiotics, which can lead to antimicrobial resistance, or underdosing of antibiotics, which can also lead to antimicrobial resistance. So for good stewardship and to prevent the selection of antimicrobial resistance, it's important to know how much the animal that you're treating weighs. Also, as I alluded to, for these antimicrobial usage metrics, we need the weight of animals that are at risk of treatment for the denominators in many of these metrics to do these calculations. And so if we think that a cow weighs 425 kilos, then we're going to get a milligrams per kilogram metric, for instance, of about 20. However, if we estimate that an adult cow weighs 680 kilos, we're going to get a milligrams per kilogram of about 12. So you can imagine if that's your antibiotic number that you're benchmark against your colleagues on, which ones the farmers are going to choose. But we would also like it to be as accurate as possible. So this is important that we are able to know that so that we're not over-representing use of antibiotics nor under-representing use of antibiotics. So it's important to know this information. We had published some previous work in this area with one of our residents who asked farmers and veterinarians and students to visually estimate the weight of cows on their operations and of calves, and then used a heart girth weigh tape to actually find out how much they weighed or to estimate how much they weighed, and found that more than half of those that were visually estimating weight were greater than 10% away from the actual weight. So they were either going to underdose or to overdose. And in fact, they tended to underestimate the weight of large animals, so they underestimated how big the cows were, but they overestimated the weight of the small animals, so they were underdosing the big animals and overdosing the small animals. So there's reasons for this, and this is what's happened in practice as part of this work as well. We asked farmers to tell us, what do you think the weight of a UK cow is? And they guessed anything from 525 kilos to 775 kilos, with a mean of about 680. So there's a wide variation in what farmers think cows weigh and what they think their own cows weigh, in fact. So in order to do this study, which, by the way, I should point out is published as an open access preprint on bioRxiv, this is a way to get your research out into the public sphere while you're waiting on it. So it's also submitted for publication, but because a lot of our work is being used to create policy in the UK, we feel that it's important to have it out there for open science, to get it out there for people to read. And it's also available then for open peer review, because just like you can read an article from the news and then put your comments below, anybody can peer review this and put their comments below. I think Reyher et al. Are rubbish. I don't understand how they did this. And that way we broaden out the amount of peer review that we get. And then once it's gone through official peer review and is published, it's automatically linked and uploaded onto the site, and the old paper is archived. So it's nice to be able to get information out there quickly. So we do preprint most of our work now, and I would encourage others to do the same. The data that we used for this study then was given to us or shared with us by some automated milking systems, by the Lely systems. These systems allow cattle to be weighed at every milking. They're often precisely calibrated, and we ask specifically that the machines be cleaned and calibrated to the weight of a known person for the data collection for this project as well, so we could get as accurate weights as possible. So these weights were provided for us by Lely with their farmers' permission, and we're very grateful for that so that we can have some data to do this work. We tried to match as closely as possible national data in the UK for percent of heifers. And when I say heifers, in the UK, first calf heifers are animals in their first lactation, and then cows are animals in their second or greater lactation. So about 30% of our national herd in the UK are these first calf heifers, so we tried to create that in our data set as well. And they match, our data set fairly matched the national data for mean lactation number of cows that we included and what's in the national herd, as well as national herd size. So that's important if we want to give an estimate of what cows are weighing in our country. We had data from almost 3,000 cattle from 20 herds, a lot of which were in the southwest of the UK, but some were also elsewhere in the UK. And we also thought it was important that we could estimate, that we could represent all of the main UK dairy breeds. So you can see here we have Holsteins, Friesians, Holstein-Friesian crosses, Jerseys, crossbreds, and other, which tended to be dual-purpose cattle. So we were happy to include all of those. And the breeds were assigned at a farm level by the farmer. This is a type of cattle that I have mainly on my farm. So it was good to be able to represent those. As we would expect, the data were normally distributed, and the heifer data, so the first lactation animals, was lower than statistically significant from the average weight of the adult animals or second and greater lactation animals. Again, the number of heifers represented the UK herd. So that's what we would expect in our data and what we showed. And the overall mean weight that we found for adult cattle was 617 kilos. And when we looked at that in a little bit more detail, when we look at these first lactation animals, they were a bit lower, 578 kilos. So if you have a greater percentage of those in your herd, you could estimate that a bit differently. Adult cows, second and greater lactation, 635 kilos was the estimate. Jerseys were about a quarter lighter than cows of other breeds or than the overall breed at about 466 kilos. And there was some variation in the overall mean across the different breeds. So you can see from this graph that the heifers are always a bit lighter. The first lactation animals are always a bit lighter. And you can see that Jerseys differed statistically significantly different, or were statistically significantly different from the other breeds, again, as we would expect. The dual-purpose cattle were a little bit heavier, not statistically significant, but they were a little bit heavier. So again, if you were doing this on a per-farm basis, you could adjust those numbers. If you just have a Jersey herd, you could just use the Jersey numbers and estimate using that as well. We wanted to investigate if production was at all related to the weight of cattle. And when we looked at cattle in all stages of lactation, there was no correlation between their production. But when we limited that to peak lactation, so between 20 and 60 days here, we could see that the cattle with greater production were heavier. So these big cows are giving more milk, and there was a positive correlation with their weight and their production in this data set. We also could see that during early lactation, the first 30 days of lactation, that the weight declined. So many cows are in negative energy balance, and that was represented in our data as well. They might be losing body condition score and they're losing weight. And after that, their weight started to steadily rise throughout their lactation. So that was represented in our data. Again, you can see the triangles are the first lactation animals, and they're lower weights than the other animals across this data set. Then we wanted to estimate the mean weights for our country, and so we needed to adjust our data to ensure that the UK cow population was accurately represented. We had all the breeds, but not in the same percentage that they were across our country. So we compared our data, and we used data from our national records, British Cattle Movement Service data, to establish what the UK breed proportions were, and then scaled our breed means according to those so that we would have an accurate weight of UK dairy cattle. And the mean weight that we arrived at was about 620 kilos, so somewhere within that estimate of our farmers, but actually a bit more than is usually presented in the literature. 600 kilos is what we usually see in the literature. So higher than is usually quoted in the literature, but we can also use these breed-specific weights for individual farms if you wanted to do these sorts of calculations on an individual farm level. So again, it's quite useful to know about the actual weight of these cows for accurate dosing decisions. So now speaking to farmers that had this wide array of guesses, we can say, well, it's more likely this, and if you're a Jersey herd, it maybe is more likely this. It's quite informative for national antimicrobial use metrics so that we can get an accurate measure of usage in our country, and it helps us to dose accurately and to measure accurately and hopefully to limit antimicrobial resistance. So this is part of the work that we're doing at the University of Bristol as our large research group called the AMR Force, and I'd like to thank all of our sponsors and our collaborators for making this sort of work possible, and you can follow us on Twitter for more information. Thank you very much.